Excited to be here with Marcus today to chat about field medical excellence and combining really the coaching and the human, the storytelling piece, as well as the AI and the technical piece and how those really interplay. So, the goal of today is really going to be to focus on and discuss those two particular portions of field medical and hopefully give you good strategies and tactics for what you can do to implement, whether it is better storytelling or how to integrate AI into the field. So, with that, Marcus, I have a question for you, which
Sure.
is what do you feel like success means in field medical? Because we oftentimes will talk about what success means in medical affairs, but zooming into field medical, how would you define that based off of, and actually maybe before we do that, we should do intros because
Yeah.
why are you the right person to talk on this topic? So Marcus, maybe if you're open to sharing a little bit of your background.
Sure, absolutely. Marcus West. So I'm the CEO and founder of 60 Seconds. 60 Seconds is a coaching app which encourages continuous learning. Doesn't replace workshops or one-to-one coaching or mentoring or training. It's just intended as a way to pull through and create a continuous learning environment based around the development of specific stipulated skills that a company might have. My background is coaching. I've coached people for more than 30 years. Originally, I had a theatre background, so I have a pretty good understanding of scripts, performance, directing, acting, voice, body language, etc. And I kind of reimagined a lot of those skills from the environment of theatre into a corporate environment. And so I spent a lot of time coaching people for television, especially politicians and corporate leaders. And the focus was on what you're saying and how you're saying it.
And I feel like that's so important for in terms of especially communicating such complex topics as a lot of the medicine can be in a way that can be digestible to any stakeholder that you're talking to over sometimes you might just have 5 minutes. You don't have, a whole 45 minutes to explain all of the intricacies. So that presentation is important. So I'm excited to hear more about how you translate that experience into the world of field medical. So with that, I'm curious, what do you think success means in field medical?
Yeah, no, it's a very big question, that one, Vera. But I think if I focus on specifically on field medical, as you suggest, I think what I see as success is preparing MSLs and medical advisors to engage with their stakeholders in a way that is memorable. And so, of course, that involves the communication of clinical insights in a manner that is engaging and thought provoking, and driving an exchange between those two key players in that medical dialogue. And I think field medical has obviously had significant change in the last 5 years. I've kind of observed that firsthand, real growth, and with that, significant investment. And with that investment, greater demands are being made. The accountability of MSLs. What are they doing? How well are they doing it? And, it's a very challenging period because a lot of these structures and processes to deliver quality outcomes are being built from the ground up, and now, to a certain extent, being rolled out within organisations to drive that change. And that's the biggest part that I'm seeing a lot of, is that change management. How companies really taking what was, a sort of outpost of the pharma company that kind of ran their own race and did things in their own way, and incorporating them very much in the centre margin and saying, right, how are you and your team going to contribute to the broader organisation and our goals? And how are you going to complement what our commercial teams are doing and our marketeers and all that good stuff? So there's more specific stuff on roles, and, we're really seeing structures and processes rolled out now that are, to a certain extent, quite successful. They're very thorough in terms of the preparation, and the
Mm.
strategy is very sound. But the hard bit is adoption, and I think this is where a lot of companies are at right now. How do we bring people on this journey so that they really begin to see the benefits of what we're trying to do, and take what used to be a fairly kind of lone wolf kind of personality type and job description, and
Mm.
bring them in as part of a team and make that something that is, unified in focus in terms of goals?
So would you say almost kind of in hearing all of that, defining success in field medical in part is really adapting to the shifts and changes that have occurred in the industry over the last couple of years, which has translated into medical affairs and field medical having more investment, having kind of a more of a lens of focus and different or evolving requirements, if you will, or I don't know if demands is the right word, but effectively, how do teams evolve from what was historically the case to adapt to the environment today? And being able
Yeah.
to do that is a success.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, look, I'll upfront say that I'm not, kind of an expert on what some of the metrics might be that define the effectiveness, share of voice. There's a whole range of kind of things that are talked about, sentiment analysis and things like that. I have some understanding of that, but I guess where my real expertise lies is in how do we get into the organization and create a culture of learning where we really help to drive excellence within the organisation to improve the quality of interactions in the field as a natural sort of outcome to that people development processes.
And I think to add to what you're saying in terms of the flip side of what are the metrics, right, or the KPIs, if you will, medical affairs more broadly. There's been this continued desire to be able to communicate the impact of a lot of different medical affairs activities and the comprehensive value of medical affairs. And field medical, right, is medical affairs activity, and it is a very high investment one from that perspective. So what we've seen more from just like a tactical side of things in terms of defining quote success in medical affairs and therefore also defining success in field medical can probably be broken down into 2 to 3 buckets of metrics to look at outside of the change management piece and kind of the coaching and the storytelling piece that you're referring to, which is there's the bucket of operational versus impact based. So operational metrics are your activity metrics, right? Impact based is more, if we have field medical out there and they're engaging with these stakeholders, did those engagements actually drive the impact that we're looking for? Impact is typically defined by the needs of the stakeholder. So in this case, it could be the HCP or the patient, but also the company, because the company has right and being part of field medical, you're part of the company, so you almost have to achieve like the impact at the intersection of all three oftentimes, which is did our interaction help make an impact on patient outcomes, on HCP understanding, and also did it move the business objectives forward scientifically for the company. So I would say this question obviously is a very loaded question. I think there's still a lot that we have to figure out from that perspective, but also to your point, because there's been such growth in medical affairs and field medical over the last couple of years, there has been a focus and accountability in terms of, okay, we're deploying these resources. How do we know we're being effective? And that's where the storytelling coaching piece is really important, right? And driving that effectiveness.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would also add to that, Vera, that I feel like there's no doubt that pharma generally is addicted to data. They love nothing more than exploring data in relation to the effectiveness of what they're doing, especially compared to competitors, and that's entirely understandable. Although I feel like some of the data that's presented involves quite a lot of guesswork. Joining the dots is I look at some of this data and I think to myself, gee, there's a bit of creative license in some of this data, and so
Got to interpret it somehow.
that's it, indeed. But I think probably, as I was speaking to a leader in this space on Monday, and he was saying, I think in medical affairs we're great at identifying gaps and, even gaps within gaps. But he said the problem is our response to that, and an effective, sustained response to respond to that gap that we've identified. And I think that was a really interesting point. There is, naturally with, the high academic nature of, your average person in medical affairs, I think, probably if they could just shift the quotient of talking about things and then doing things in response, and doing more of the latter,
Mm.
actioning stuff to improve the shortcomings that they identify, then I think that will be, and that's connected to the change management piece, right? Academics like to talk about things endlessly, and I think whereas if you look at the sales function, they're probably the opposite. They probably just like doing. So I
Yeah.
think you probably got a little contrast there. So I think a little more action oriented, specific, achievable goals, and some processes to achieve those goals, and then a sustained activity metrics around that, and qualitative measurement of outcomes. These are the things that really need to be engaged with in a sustained manner to deliver outcomes. And I'm not suggesting by any means that that is easily done, but it's
Right.
certainly something that the companies that manage to do it are going to have field teams that are considerably superior to those who have been, I guess, paralyzed by over analysis.
Yeah, and to add to your point with what that leader was referring to, something that I've oftentimes heard across the board, especially from MSLs, is that it can feel like, and also management, it can feel like there's a lack of a feedback loop, right? So, for example, if I, as an MSL, uncover potentially an interesting, actionable insight that you can action on, and then that gets, funneled into some sort of report on a monthly, quarterly basis, whatever that cadence is. And then something happens to that insight. And then does it get actioned? We don't know. And it almost seems like the intention is for there to be a feedback loop because it gives clarity to everyone. It gives motivation, right? So I, as MSL, know I'm making an impact to the company and the work that I'm doing is actually going, somewhere and it's being acted on. But I think it speaks to partly that gap that you're referring to, which is you can identify the gaps by sifting through the insights, but there needs to be that feedback loop
Yeah.
also that
Uh,
exists to then action on it.
100%. And obviously my perspective is quite interesting because we are talking to people in field medical excellence, 6 or 8 times a week from different companies, from your smaller biotechs through to the big thing. I always begin that conversation, the first introductory chat, by asking, well, what are your processes around providing feedback to
Mm.
field teams? And, do you have a medical manager? And is that medical manager's job to provide a coaching and sustained coaching and feedback to the MSL? And it's really extraordinary, to be honest, that the structure and the execution around people development is really quite different in pretty much every organization that I go to.
Mm.
And I think that's a problem, because coaching and improvement doesn't happen by accident. It needs to be done deliberately. You need to commit time to it, need to have structures and processes around it, needs to be measurable. And, if none of that is there, and I know for a fact that there are a lot of companies, it's on a bell curve, obviously, but there are some companies who do little to nothing. And then there are some companies who are trying, but they probably don't have the structures and processes kind of clearly defined enough. And then there are other companies who have a good structure, and but probably they're still not quite there in terms of really committing time to having that discussion between coach and coachee around what good looks like and how we're going to get there together.
Got it. And I think that's a great segue, I feel like, in part to the, kicking off the conversation of the evolving role of field medical. Because I think one question that comes up for me, and I'm curious to hear your perspective on that, is why bother changing? Like, why introduce coaching? Why focus on storytelling, right? Why resource, or why put a process around it? Because if historically, if things have been, quote, working, like we've always kind of done it this way, then what is the impetus for the change? And I'm curious what you've seen with teams, that you've worked with. What has caused them to focus on that?
Well, first of all, I'd say that the appetite for change is very rarely found within human beings generally. So
Sure.
I think if we start with that idea and use it as a bit of a common denominator, yeah, no, I think it has to come down to how do we, I guess, incentivize, and not just monetarily, but obviously from a perspective of what's in it for me. So if we look, our major primary focus is on medical exchange, or scientific exchange, as some companies call it, and how effectively do to these MSLs, managing these meetings, handling difficult questions, giving clinical insights, maybe using some storytelling techniques, and around all those skills, how are we, which mind you, are quite complex and just learnt by accident, they must be developed over time. People must share best practice. But I suppose for the MSL starting out or comparatively inexperienced, the motivation should be there. We're going to take you on a learning journey, and this is where you are now. And now we're going to, work on turning you into this somebody who's authoritative, somebody who's a credible ambassador for medical science. And that to me is a great thing for those junior MSLs. The ones in the middle kind of area who've been doing it for a while, how can they sharpen those skills? And then I think the ones who are really experienced and probably can often be the toughest to deal with in terms of, engaging with, now we're going to go on a bit of a learning journey because I don't feel they need it. So how do we leverage their experience and get them to feed and become, if you like, a thought leader within the organization, to share best practice around their approach to the scientific exchange, and then therefore allow that kind of expertise and that panache that they demonstrate to trickle down to those more junior in the organization, and then they can learn from that. And then on the flip side, the coach, the role of the manager, mostly the
Right.
medical manager, what's in it for them? How can we make coaching attractive to them? And critically, the organization has to make time for it. And then they have to spend some time helping these managers to understand what coaching means, and then how to have these sometimes, quite tricky conversations with team members around that improvement, and coming back to that and making that coaching conversation something that is ongoing. It's enormously beneficial and satisfying to do coaching well and to see somebody improving before your very eyes. But it's not easily done, and there needs to be structures and processes set up, and managers need the skill development, ongoing mentoring to be able to do it well.
And from what you're saying, it sounds like to me part of what is driving in terms of the field medical role, and I know we've talked about how it has shifted over the last couple of years, but part of the shift that is driven also more of a focus on whether it's coaching, storytelling, or being really good at engaging with stakeholders is the fact that, one, there's more of a focus on medical affairs because of the heavier investment and importance. Two, what I generally see as well is medicine holistically has gotten a lot more complex. So there is more complex science, there's more nuance that needs to be communicated. Medicine is not, quote, simple. So I'm just using this as like a lay term, but it's not as
Yes.
simple, if you will, as it used to be. And field medical, right, being the voice of the science of the company, it's important to be able to weave all of the nuances and complexities in an understandable way to really engage with your stakeholder and deliver value for the company and the patient, et cetera. And then ultimately, it just drives more effectiveness and internal culture. Because part of, earlier in our conversation with the feedback loop, like the kind of the black hole, if you will, of field medical insights, like insights go in, we don't know what happens to them. I mean, that can have an impact on culture. Because if I'm sitting there and I'm engaging with HCPs and I don't know where, is what I'm doing working? Is it being used by the company? Do I see the kind of the full feedback loop? And that doesn't help with retention. So I think ultimately by providing that feedback and coaching, and also to your point, having the more expert MSLs kind of trickle down their expertise to the culture of the organization, kind of creates this internal culture and retention and satisfaction within MSLs. Would you say that those three kind of represent how the field medical role has shifted and why it's important? Or do you feel like there's other things that I might have forgotten?
No. I think you've covered off some really key points there. And I think, to me, if companies aren't doing this, then they're really missing an opportunity to not only improve their people and improve outcomes for patients and improve that dialogue with the doctor, but I think they're going to end up losing staff because people are going to go to other organisations where they are nurtured. And I think there's going to be a bit of an arms race in this area, I
Mhm.
think, over the next 4 or 5 years, because certain companies are going to get a reputation as being companies that nurture their talent and develop people over time and sharpen their skills, and others not so much. And so I think that will be a really important part. The other aspect of things that I think we haven't discussed in a lot of detail is for leadership of field medical. They need to be able to report to management, this is what we're doing. This is why our team is really operating at a higher level. This is how
Mhm.
they're effective. And this is how we're measuring it. And here are the analytics to support what we're doing.
Right.
And I think there's an enormous case to be made there beyond the McKinsey white papers, that everybody reads and everyone's across. I'm talking about what's your team actually doing with the millions of dollars that we invest in field medical each year. Tell me what
Right.
you're doing. And so I think for the head of medical excellence or, the equivalent within these organizations to be able to palpably report on the effectiveness of their people development programs is enormously advantageous.
Yeah, and I think, you just gave me an idea for, I feel like if I'm field medical excellence, one way to be able to tie the effectiveness of the coaching and storytelling in a measurable way could be, okay, you have your, MSL team across various spectrum of experience, right? And you're doing this coaching, you're teaching them, XYZ ways to engage. And if you in those engagements are either able to track things like sentiment or surveys, after those engagements, you can quarter over quarter, right? Now start to track changes and you can start to tie, okay, also all of this coaching, the storytelling, this training we're doing to improve the team, this is how it's actually driving impact in terms of the individual engagements. And the combination, I think, can be really powerful for managers to present to leadership.
Absolutely.
So I know we kind of already started talking about the kind of the coaching piece. But the one thing actually I was going to say before we dig into this slide, I feel like the other big shift that has happened is really that there is now, you have omni-channel. And I know that's this buzzword that gets thrown around, but back in the day, in person was really the one way you could engage, or maybe the telephone. But before that existed, just in person or snail mail. But even more so now, over the last couple of years, I feel like the role of the MSL and also the managers of MSL teams have had to evolve to not only just use the traditional channels that we think about, right? But also, webinars or online or social media, right? Those newer channels. And I think as whether it's an MSL or a manager of MSLs, that storytelling has to adapt to the channel. It's not
Of
just this
course.
one way of telling the story. So it's almost like the role of field medical has evolved in that capacity as well, which means that there has to be an adjustment to the tactical execution piece that you're talking about to encompass that.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I think, it's like a Hollywood movie. You've got the sizzle reel, which is about 90 seconds long.
Yeah.
You got the whole movie, you've got posters, you got all manner of exploring and disseminating that content. That's just another sort of metaphorical example, but to me, it makes perfect sense to use as a parallel. Just there's one interesting point that I thought I'd raise here, and that is what I'm also hearing a lot about the stakeholders in medical affairs is that they're, because the MSLs, given their scientific prowess, are able to get increased access. They
Mm.
are, really, that's the big thing, right? I mean, these bosses of these companies are going, well, this MSL is getting 20 minutes. My sales rep's getting 2 minutes.
Oh, wow.
So, I really, we've got to leverage that 20 minutes to its fullest extent. But I think another thing that they're raising is it's not just the KOL, because this is, obviously we always sort of see MSL to KOL interactions, and that's sort of heavy scientific detail, clinical exploration, etc. Obviously crucial. However, what we're seeing a lot more is also, nurse educators, CPs. So MSLs are being called upon to communicate to different
Mm.
audiences
Mhm.
who have a different level of understanding, different areas of interest, but still in their own way influential in the broader scheme of things with patients. And so, therefore, how do we prepare our content that is going to align with the audience that we're telling
Right.
that story to, which is obviously absolutely critical to ask yourself before you tell any story, is this right for the audience that I'm going to tell it to?
And I think you just answered one of the questions, which is ultimately, I feel like, why to invest in coaching or focusing on storytelling. What is because, to your point, not only have the audiences gotten a lot more complex, but there's more channels to communicate on. So it's no longer just, research centric KOLs where you can maybe communicate super technically, right, with a didactic like presentation over one medium or one channel. It's now a varied spectrum of people with different experiences across channels that might have a 30-second attention span to, a 20-minute engagement with an HCP. And that translation piece is critical for the effectiveness, or translation between, and what I mean by translation is like translation, to different audiences, right? Or
Yes.
to different format of the different channels, if you will.
That's right. Repackaging the content based on who you're speaking with. I mean, the same can be said given your background. You'd be very used to this, but obviously, when you're dealing with things that are highly technical in the IT space, and maybe you're talking to investors, or maybe you're
Right.
talking to a developer, or maybe you're talking to a potential customer. The three conversations you're having there completely different. And
Yes.
so, therefore, it does require a little bit of, mental preparation in the moments before the interaction, but also preparation of content in advance and reflection post engagement on the effectiveness of how that material landed and was understood.
Yes. And that's why I call it translation, because I feel like every time I have to like translate, and sometimes it's interesting. I'm sure, MSLs have, or anyone really who has had to translate anything to different audiences can relate to this, which is you might have one term like Gen AI, for example, but people have 5 million different interpretations of, like, a technical person will have a very different understanding of Gen AI than a non-technical person, than a person in marketing, than a person in medical affairs. So it's almost like, I feel like sometimes half of the conversation is just making sure, like, what are our definitions here so we can know how to communicate with each other. So I think, to your point, it just goes to really the importance of being able to have the skill set of storytelling, and coaching is a big piece of that. I guess on that front, like if you were talking to a team, whether, to small to a large company, how can a team kind of evaluate, if you will? I don't know if there's like a mini quiz of evaluating where you are on your storytelling, coaching, training journey as an MSL team. How do you feel like teams can kind of evaluate where they're at today? And what steps can teams take once they've evaluated to start to improve their, storytelling skills for teams?
Yeah, I think there are, I mean, obviously, having some kind of before and after kind of view of, this is where we're at now. This is the goal for where we'd like to get to. These are the skills that probably aren't as fully developed as they might be just yet. These are the ones we're going to work on. I mean, for us at 60 Seconds, we have like a customizable platform. So essentially, you can take whatever qualitative metrics you would like to measure based on what you see somebody when they're talking on video, right? So we can see soft
Mm,
skills, we can hear what they're saying, we can hear the tone of voice, we can analyze the effectiveness and the impact of their delivery. Obviously, this is in a rehearsal environment.
right.
But still, I don't think there's anything wrong. In fact, I would strongly encourage that organisations ought to be practicing more out loud. That deliberate out loud practice is absolutely crucial. And I always use the analogy of either dancers or sports
Mm,
people. The majority of time they spend is in practice. It's not even training, and even playing the game, so to speak, is probably 20%, and then the other 80% is practice and commitment to practice. And as my daughter's ballet teacher once said, perfect practice makes perfect. So I think that's the idea of being quite deliberate in what you're doing, as opposed to saying, oh, this is all just practice, this is all just role play. No, it's not. You've got to commit to it, and you've got to imagine
mm,
it, because developing and hardening skills in a practice environment, reflecting on it, doing it again, means that when you're actually in the cauldron of the interaction, then being able to pivot, being able to relax into the interaction, and to deploy all those skills, because those skills have become part of who you are as a communicator.
right. They're almost so ingrained where you're almost not thinking, you're not literally thinking about them in the actual interaction. So you're able to adapt in the situation because it's so ingrained. And I
Yeah.
can relate to that with dance. So I mean, whether it's ballet, but a lot of dancing is ingraining things into your body, where once you get enough experience as a dancer, and you see all those cool choreos that everyone does and they seem so professional and relaxed. Well, it's because they've ingrained so much of the choreo into their body that they actually spend the dance, portion of it like adding their own spin because they're not
Yeah.
thinking about what's the next move. Their body just knows, and I feel like it's similarly here where you're not now in quote the real world conversation, you're not thinking about, oh, what is like the right perfect storytelling thing to do next. It just is ingrained.
Yes, 100%. I think that's, and to me, if positioned correctly with field medical, it becomes, the biggest challenge you have is to take something that's enormously complex and communicate that in a way that makes it interesting, compelling, but of course, crucially, easily understood. And, that is enormously difficult. But then beyond that, how are your skills in relation to asking questions? Do you know the difference between an open and a closed question? Do you know how to run a meeting? Do you understand what it is to, propose an agenda? Do you understand what it means at the end of the meeting to actually offer a summary of what's been said and then actually agree on what's going to happen next? I think these aren't skills that are necessarily simple. They're skills that need to be practiced and they need to be coached on, they need to be reflected upon, and they need to be constantly refined. And you'll see people who have different areas of expertise and we can learn from each other. And I think if you create that environment where people can really see themselves on a journey of being more effective, then I don't know many people who don't want to be a part of that. I'm happy to remain mediocre. If you want to go on this journey, we'll
Yeah.
take you on it. And that can be really exciting, I think. And that's the way that it needs to be positioned. And that positioning of it is so important in the engagement around any of these processes. Because if you don't position it properly, people deprioritize it.
Got it. So I'm curious, there's kind of three questions that have come up for me in all of this. So I'll try to remember them if we get through all three. One, I'm curious about, in having worked with a lot of field medical teams on the coaching and storytelling side, are there like the top 2 to 3 most common storytelling gaps, if you will, that you've seen teams have? And what are they?
Yeah, no, sure. I think the ability to vary language, I think, becomes
Mm,
really important. The biggest challenge we constantly hear sort of leaders of MSL teams raise is our MSLs talk too much and it's just really dense in terms of the content. So they just, the obvious, often
mm,
referred to as a data dump. So I think that being able to work out how to be a little more succinct is crucial. And then having an understanding of structure. Obviously, all great stories have the 3 acts of the beginning, the middle, and the end. And so, if you've got a really significant clinical insight to explore and to tell that story, how do you imbue it with a nice tight structure that gives it that nice sense of flow that human beings naturally engage with? That's what human beings expect in stories, that they have a beginning, a middle, and an end. So they're two fairly crucial aspects of storytelling that provide a really nice starting point.
And I'm curious then, to go off of that, how are there quota? Because I use this for insights, and kind of helping teams understand where they are on their insights journey and what steps they would need to take next to improve within their insights journey. So I'm curious on this front of scientific engagement and storytelling, are there kind of quote symptoms that you think managers or leaders can look out for to know, okay, actually, now that I'm seeing this, I think that's a good time to, engage in some sort of training. I mean, in theory, it should be all the time you're improving, etc. I get that. But I'm curious if there's quote symptoms that you think folks can look out for.
Yeah, well, probably being brutal, the biggest symptom of all is being bored, isn't it, really? I mean, if your audience is not engaged, then as the communicator, for a range of different reasons, you haven't managed to do as well as you could. So that's a big factor. How engaged is my audience? And I think inexperienced MSLs will feel they have done a good job if they get through a certain amount of information. But actually, as we get more experienced in these interactions, the better the interaction, the more vigorous the exchange, the more effective the interaction has been, because you're actually drawing out that
Mm,
healthcare professional on their views, having a proper discussion with them. I mean, if you're there pouring out your heart on some really sort of exquisite piece of science and you're 5 minutes into the spiel, then the chances of that person genuinely engaging and really hearing everything that you're saying, I think is reasonably low. I think they're probably thinking about what they're going to have for lunch.
Got it. Role as well. And, I think this is a good segue into more of perhaps the AI data tech piece of it, which is what we're going to chat through next. But I'm
Sure.
curious, with this whole quote translation piece we've talked about of like you have different audiences, right? How do you take something that's a quote data dump and translate it into something that's a bit more digestible for whoever's receiving it? What role do you think Gen AI might have to play in helping folks take, let's say this raw data dump of a presentation or a narrative and then help convert it to quote resonate with different audiences or maybe translate it into more simplified language, if you will, that's more digestible. What are your thoughts on that? Because that's a hot, Gen AI, of course, the most obvious use case has always been content generation. So I think this is one area that folks have most obviously gravitated towards.
Yeah, I think there are two things that I could come up with here. I mean, I'm not, as mentioned, anywhere near an expert on these things, but I see Gen AI. Yeah, I think there are two things that I could come up with here. I mean, I'm not, as mentioned, anywhere near an expert on these things, but I see Gen AI as a great way to start the exploration of an idea. So, writers always say that, or writer's block, the
Yes.
greatest challenge for a writer is the blank page. It's kind of like, what am I going to come up with? So to
Yeah.
me, if Gen AI can provide you with a starting point, some ideas, get something down which you can then
Mm-hmm.
wrestle with and manage. So that's that nice combination of human input and AI. And then to your point on translating like that, some of these narratives to make them more accessible for the audience that you're engaging with, I think that would be a great way to streamline the activity too. I mean, again, I think it's very important that we see this as a drafting process only. I think that's important. It's an injection of ideas. And then from there, you can begin to fashion something that's really memorable. Being able to really tease out that language and really get that turn of phrase right and make sure the structure's tight. You need human input for that. But I do think that Gen AI can really provide some great starting points and some reimagining of existing material just to kind of get you thinking, get those processes kind of going. Don't forget, though, that I think, going through that process of developing an insight and fashioning it and drafting it and kind of, turning it into something that's tight and right and bright and engaging, going through that process mentally, that's making you sharper. So I think you've just got to find that balance. You still need to put yourself, through that challenge because obviously that really makes you more effective. And while you're doing that, you're turning all those ideas over in your mind. They're all kind of, being processed, if you like, cerebrally. And
Right.
again, that's just going to make you more effective. The last thing you want is somebody who's, delivering lines, so to speak, and they look a little bit kind of rote in their delivery, or robotic. They need to own the content, make it their own, deliver it passionately and with insight. And that will, of course, build the interaction, build their credibility.
Right. And I think to riff off of the couple of points that you made there, I think one, with AI or any technology, there's always that phrase of the data quality and, garbage in, garbage out. And I think when
Mm,
it comes to generating narratives and stories, it's the same thing in the sense of if you have, garbage input into Gen AI, it's going to come out with a garbage narrative. So to your point of you still have to, even with AI, it is not going to end replace humans for two reasons. One, because when you think about large language models or Gen AI, they're trained and there's this principle of like regressing to the mean. So like over time with enough data, everything regresses to the mean. So if you
sure.
don't put your own intelligence, into crafting the right input into the Gen AI model, you're just regressing to the mean. So, I mean, everyone's made this argument for Gen AI for coding. You can have a generate code and it'll probably work and be mediocre and it'll get the job done like majority of the time, which is amazing. I mean, this is not in any way to knock, Gen AI down. It's been, I mean, I use it all the time. But I think to your point of there's still those human elements that are required and you can't use Gen AI as a crutch. It's not going to be the thing to make you stand out.
No, of course not. And that's why I think, to a certain extent, newspapers, the creative industries, obviously you need protections in place. But I don't think AI is the enormous threat that people, think that it is, because human creativity is unbounded. So I think there's scope for both, as you say.
Yeah, and I think part of the fear stems from just not knowing it, not understanding it
Yeah.
fully, and then also, ironically with media, I feel like there's a certain narrative that gets perpetrated on social media and through media about AI being the scary thing,
Yeah.
that's going to
Yeah.
take over and do everything end to end, which if you are like, I'm not an MD, in colon cancer. I could not, like, if some media was trying to scare me about colon cancer, right? I don't have an informed opinion because I'm not an MD. And I sometimes feel like it's similar with AI, where there's all of this narratives that are being spilled. But if you actually look at how things are tactically executed on the AI side, it becomes a lot more clear what the applications are and what to actually be scared of. Which, what to be scared of is not losing your job. It's more of how do you turn something, I think in particular with Gen AI, which is really great at creating demos. Like you can go and you can get it to compose a song in, the style of Taylor Swift or whatever about, your drug that you're trying to communicate about.
Yeah.
And maybe
Yeah.
that's good for social media. But it's not, it's like cool for fun demos. But I think to make something actually production ready where you can reliably rely on the outcomes and outputs of that model requires so much more and typically requires human input. And this is
Yes.
where, like, even, outside of just the perhaps like the coaching component of it, like with the work that we do in helping medical affairs teams, inclusive of field medical, take their unstructured data, be it CRM notes or whatever else, and translate that into operational or impact measures so you can measure the progress, uncover those gaps to inform your medical strategy. And then also, if you're a manager, right, or a leader, how do you report and show progress to your leadership? I mean, like that orchestration and leveraging any technology, inclusive of AI, is beyond just Gen AI. It's not just, oh, you prompted and all of a sudden, like, you have all these insights and you're going to make medical strategic decisions off of what Gen AI outputs. I mean, I wouldn't do that. Do you know, like I would need to,
Yeah. Yeah.
I would
Yeah.
need to trust because this is a serious thing. So anyway, I think that's all to say, like, to your point around how it's not something to be scared of. I think it can be
And I think in terms of what the human input brings, what the MSL can bring to that clinical narrative is tone, personality, passion. There's a whole range of things that really kind of, I guess, grease the wheels from a communicative sense that just a basic script won't give you. And that's why I think, when you're telling these clinical narratives, that's why it's so important around communication to practice things out loud. Because if you're not
Mhm.
practicing out loud, you're not listening to something back, then it's like seeing notes of music on a page. That's not a symphony. A symphony must have instruments, and then it needs a conductor, and it needs a whole lot of things to make it into this thing that is quite intangible in a simpler way for an MSL in the act of communication. There are some elements that really allow the story to have impact, and those are very much the human elements.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, the more quantifiable perspective of how do you put in this kind of human storytelling narrative and experience, which is hard to quantify into numbers. But I think in business, we have to quantify everything to try to at least create some sort of proxy or measure of progress. And I think ultimately, any talk around AI or data or technology, which is where we sit, this is why it's important to integrate it. It's because you can leverage AI or technology to help you become a better storyteller, or it is to help measure the impact and progress of, hey, we're coaching, we're training, we have this scientific narrative, it seems like the reception and the engagement, right, from what we're able to tell is really good. Is that being reflected in other metrics important for the medical affairs function for the business? Did it drive better NPS surveys for doctors post engagement? Did those doctors have a deeper understanding of certain topics than before? Right. So all
Mhm.
of those are proxy signals that tie in the power and improvement in storytelling to actual impact and progress that on field medical that you can report up to leadership, right? To present like, hey, we're doing all of this and we're actually seeing results and this is how, and also to showcase to the MSLs for better kind of feedback, right? Of, hey, like this is really working. We're actually seeing it be reflected in, an HCP's understanding of the material and content. So, and the reason why I emphasize this is because oftentimes with field medical and medical affairs, folks get excited about AI. So like, what are the use cases? Show, MSL Copilot, this, that, and the other. And I totally understand because AI is kind of can be this ambiguous topic. So you want to see examples and you're like, okay, I see AI can do this. So maybe I can extrapolate from that and be like, maybe I can apply AI here. So I totally understand why there's a desire to see all the use cases of AI. But fundamentally, I think we need to go back to why does AI even matter? Like, why should medical affairs and field medical even use AI? Besides, like, yes, it's a hype thing, people are excited about it, et cetera, et cetera. But like fundamentally, if we ignore that, why? And this is why. It's for, better storytelling in support with a human coach, but also for better storytelling, for being able to measure impact. Because at a certain point, you can't manually sit through and read through all the surveys and read through all the notes, which is what some teams do today, which is, that's fine, but you don't have to. And that's kind of nice. Because if you don't have to do all the manual grunt work, you know what you can focus on? Better storytelling. Do you know what I mean? Like that,
Yeah.
I feel like would probably drive more impact and progress forward than being stuck in a spreadsheet trying to categorize and label insight. And that's why AI can be helpful. It can help automate that process. It can help give you things like sentiment, right? Or understanding and evaluating where an HCP might be in their educational understanding of your scientific narrative, which you can use as a proxy metric to measure progress of the coaching that you're talking about, which is how you get your MSL team to be better at storytelling. Anyway, I'm going to pause here because I've been on a little rant about AI. Curious to hear if that resonates with you.
Well, I think is there somebody asking a question there? Somebody
Hello.
saying hi, at least, anyway.
Yes. Yes, I know we have a couple minutes left. So if folks want to ask questions, feel free to throw them into the chat. But maybe in the meantime, any last sort of parting thoughts on storytelling, AI, impact, and field medical?
Yeah, no, look, I think a few interesting points have been raised. I really like your last point there on streamlining people's activities, I think, saving people time. If AI can do that and allow more time for things like coaching or other things that really focus on that human resource being valued and developed over time so that, they can be more engaged with those key things. It's like so many interactions we see by field teams kind of rushed and jammed into other work commitments of the day. And I think one of the great challenges we see in coaching and developing people is, okay, you've got this 10-minute interaction, how are you going to make that interaction really useful and impactful and memorable? And what's achievable in that time frame? I think that's another question to ask, because often people are trying to jam too much information into what's a finite period of time and they do it unsuccessfully. They run out of time, they don't draw a reaction. So I think anything that could be done to help people be more proficient in their communication is obviously going to be a great outcome, especially when you multiply it by 50 or 100 MSLs. You're talking about 10, 20% growth in people's communication skill. The uplift on that, the ripple effect from that is, really quite seismic.
Yeah, it compounds, especially over that volume. So I feel like if I had to kind of summarize a bit, it's almost like there is the storytelling component of it is more important now than ever, really, given the evolving focus on medical affairs and field medical from a resourcing perspective, the complexity of the medicine, the different audiences, the channels, and even with the rise of AI, the human component is still one of the most important things, especially in field medical. So I think that's one. And then two, from a tech AI perspective, really where it can come and help is one, I know for you guys, you have a coaching app. So there is elements of tech and AI that can be helpful in refining and reinforcing and kind of upskilling folks and being that training ground. And then on the flip side, AI and tech in medical affairs and field medical is important because of being able to actually measure impact or operational metrics and progress. And that's why AI matters. It can take that grunt work out, of being able to parse through all of that data to refine things like sentiment, your operational metrics, categorization, looking at claims and diagnostics data compliantly, to see if you've moved the needle. I mean, there's so many ways you can cut it, but the reality is there's too much data for a human to be able to handle. So like AI really can come in to kind of create that feedback loop metrically, if you will, in being able to measure field medical excellence. So that's why that's important. Awesome. Well, thank you, Marcus. Thank you, everyone. If there's any sort of questions that you guys have, feel free to either DM us on LinkedIn, reach out via the emails here. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks a lot, Vera.